The horrors of Nazi camps are parched into history, but the brutal role of female guards is often forgotten. Dorothea Binz stood out not just because of her position, but because of the cruelty she unleashed. She wielded power like a weapon, striking fear into thousands inside the Ravensbrück. But her story didn't end with the war, as her sadistic actions led to her execution on May 2nd, 1947. Dorothea Binz was born on March 16, 1920, in a small town called Parched, located near the northeastern German city of Neustrelitz. This area was part of the state of Mecklenburg at the time. She came from a modest background. Her family wasn't wealthy or politically important. Her father worked an ordinary job, and her early years were spent in a quiet, rural setting. There's no record of any early violence or unusual behavior from her. In fact, her childhood seemed fairly typical for that era in Germany. During the 1920s and early 30s, Germany was struggling with political instability and poverty. After World War I, the country had fallen into an economic crisis. Unemployment was high, and life was difficult for many families. These were the years of the Weimar Republic, a time when Germany's government was weak and constantly changing. People were desperate for stability and strong leadership. By the time Dorothea was a teenager, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party had already taken power. Hitler became chancellor in 1933 when Dorothea was just 13. From that point on, German schools, newspapers, and even youth groups were filled with Nazi ideas. Young people were taught to believe in Nazi values like loyalty to the state, racial purity, and obedience. Many teenagers were pulled into organizations like the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls, which trained girls to serve the Nazi system. It's not clear how involved Dorothea was in these groups, but she grew up surrounded by Nazi propaganda. Like many others her age, she was shaped by it. After finishing school, she didn't go to university or pursue a big career. Instead, she stayed close to home. In 1939, the same year Germany invaded Poland and World War II officially began, Dorothea was just 19 years old. That year, she applied for a job at the Ravensbrück concentration camp. Ravensbrück wasn't like the other concentration camps built by the Nazis. It was special, in one terrible way. It was made only for women. Located about 50 miles north of Berlin, this camp became the main place where the Nazi regime imprisoned female political prisoners, resistance fighters, Jews, Roma women, and anyone else they considered a threat. From 1939 to 1945, about 130,000 women were sent there, many dying from forced labor, starvation, disease, abuse, or being killed outright. When Dorothea first arrived at Ravensbrück, she was just one of many women working behind the scenes. But she stood out quickly. She was cold and strict, and seemed to enjoy having power over others. In a place already filled with fear, Dorothea added another layer of terror. She followed every SS rule without question and showed no mercy. By 1943, just 4 years after she started working there, Dorothea had become the deputy chief guard. That position gave her enormous control. She wasn't in charge of just a few prisoners. She had authority over tens of thousands. She was responsible for how the women were treated every day, and instead of using her position to help anyone, she turned it into a tool for violence. The women sent to Ravensbrück came from all across Europe. Many were arrested just for standing up to the Nazis. Some were political prisoners, teachers, writers, or activists who spoke out against Hitler. Others were resistance fighters from countries like Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. Many had risked their lives to hide Jews, carry messages, or fight back in small underground groups. There were also Jewish women, Roma women, and those targeted through Nazi racial laws simply because of their background, their religion, or even a disability. But to Dorothea, none of that mattered. She didn't see these women as human beings. She treated them all the same, with cruelty, violence, and zero compassion. Every morning there were roll calls where the women had to line up, no matter how cold or sick they were. Sometimes they stood for hours without moving, and this is where Dorothea would often pick out her victims. She would walk through the rows slowly, scanning the faces. If someone looked weak, tired, or didn't stand up straight, she would drag them out and beat them in front of everyone. And the beatings weren't quick or controlled. They were brutal and meant to scare the others. There were times when she didn't even use a reason. She might simply point to someone and order them to be punished. Worse, she often forced other prisoners to do it. Women were made to hit each other, clean up blood, or hold down victims during the beatings. It turned daily life in the camp into something even more twisted and terrifying. Prisoners not only had to fear the guards, they were also trapped in a system that turned them against each other. What made it even more disturbing was how Dorothea acted during these punishments. Survivors said she sometimes smiled or laughed while hurting someone. She didn't hide her enjoyment. In her eyes, power came from fear, and the more pain she caused, the more respect she thought she earned among the SS staff. One of her victims was a Polish woman who had been arrested for helping the resistance in Warsaw. She had been caught passing messages to a local resistance group, and that alone was enough to be sent to Ravensbrück. Dorothea beat her so badly in front of the others that she collapsed and was never the same again. Other women said she could barely walk afterward and had to be carried by her friends. She didn't last much longer in the camp. Stories like that were not rare. They happened every day, in every part of the camp. Dorothea used her position not to keep order, but to dominate and destroy. Women who had already lost everything were made to suffer even more under her watch. Dorothea didn't act alone in her cruelty. At Ravensbrück, she formed a close and disturbing relationship with another SS guard named Edmund Breining. He was one of the male staff members at the camp, and just like Dorothea, he was known for being cold, harsh, and violent. The two of them quickly became more than just co-workers. They were lovers, and their relationship became part of what made life even more terrifying for the prisoners. Witnesses later said that Dorothea and Edmund were often seen walking through the camp together like they were out on a casual stroll. But there was nothing casual about what they did. Their connection seemed to strengthen their taste for violence. They didn't hide what they were doing, and there were several reports that they took part in punishing women together. Sometimes they watched beatings side by side. Other times they laughed while prisoners screamed. Some survivors said it felt like they fed off each other's cruelty. This relationship gave Dorothea even more power. She wasn't just a guard with high rank. Now she had someone who supported and encouraged her brutal behavior. She began doing things that went far beyond her orders. Even other guards started to fear her, not just because of her actions, but because of her growing influence inside the camp. Some SS officers started to notice how out of control things were getting. But instead of stopping her, many chose to look the other way. Ravensbrück was already a place where violence was normal. But what Dorothea and Edmund were doing was extreme, even by SS standards. Still, no one in charge seriously stepped in. That allowed the abuse to continue and even grow worse. By 1944, Dorothea's reputation had spread outside of Ravensbrück. Other camps and SS staff knew who she was. She wasn't just another guard. She had become a symbol of what extreme cruelty looked like inside the Nazi camp system. She trained new guards, gave orders, and punished prisoners with total freedom. The two of them created a cycle of abuse that left long-lasting scars on the women they tortured. By late 1944, the tide of World War II had completely turned. Germany was clearly losing. The Allies were advancing from the west after landing in Normandy in June, and the Soviet army was storming in from the east, pushing through Poland with heavy force. German cities were being bombed, Nazi troops were retreating, and panic had begun to spread across the Nazi system. It was only a matter of time before everything collapsed. Inside Ravensbrück, things started to fall apart too. Supplies ran low, there wasn't enough food, water, or medicine. Disease began to spread. And still, trains brought in more prisoners from other camps that had already been abandoned. The Nazis were trying to cover up what they had done, so they moved people around to confuse the Allies and destroy the evidence. Records were burned. Crematoriums worked non-stop to get rid of bodies. Orders came down to erase everything before the Allies arrived. But even during this final desperate phase, Dorothea didn't stop. While some guards started to back off and try to protect themselves, she kept going. Her punishments became even more random and violent. Some survivors said she acted like the war wasn't ending at all. She continued walking through the camp with her whip and pistol, still looking for prisoners to punish. As the Soviet forces got closer in the spring of 1945, Ravensbrück descended into chaos. Bombs could be heard in the distance. SS officers started fleeing. Trucks were loaded up with supplies. Some prisoners were marched out of the camp in death marches, long walks with no food or water, meant to keep them from being rescued alive. Those who stayed behind waited in fear, unsure if they would be killed or saved. On April 30th, 1945, the Red Army finally reached Ravensbrück. What they found was horrifying. Bodies, starving prisoners, and a camp that had been turned into a nightmare. But by that point, Dorothea was gone. Like many other SS guards, she had tried to escape. She took off her uniform and slipped away, blending in with the flood of German civilians and refugees who were fleeing from the east. She hoped she could disappear, avoid capture, and start a new life without anyone knowing what she had done. She wasn't alone. Thousands of Nazis tried the same thing. Some went into hiding in small villages. Others used fake names. A few even escaped the country. The chaos at the end of the war gave them a chance to vanish. But Dorothea didn't get far. British forces operating in northern Germany found her. Survivors from Ravensbrück who had been freed by the Soviets gave the British soldiers a description of the woman who had tortured them. The details matched Dorothea exactly. Soon, she was arrested and sent to a British internment camp, where captured Nazis were being held for questioning. At first, she denied everything. Like many others, she said she had just been following orders. But there were too many witnesses. Too many survivors had seen what she had done, and they were ready to speak. In 1946, Dorothea became one of the main people on trial during the Ravensbrück trials, held in Hamburg, Germany. Out of all the women on trial, Dorothea stood out. She was one of the youngest, but her crimes were some of the most brutal. The courtroom was filled with tension as the survivors began to testify. One by one, women came forward to tell their stories. Many of them were Polish, French, Soviet, or German women who had been political prisoners, resistance fighters, or victims of Nazi racial laws. Some were still sick or weak, but they wanted the world to hear what they had been through. One Polish survivor described how Dorothea would walk slowly past lines of prisoners during roll call. She would point at someone for no reason, order them to be beaten, or sent to punishment. Another woman told the court how she once watched Dorothea beat a fellow prisoner until she collapsed. But Dorothea didn't stop. She kept kicking her, even while she was lying on the ground, bleeding and unable to move. And the stories didn't stop there. More survivors spoke of the way Dorothea seemed to enjoy the pain she caused. She laughed, they said. She smiled during punishments. She didn't act like someone following orders. She acted like someone who wanted to hurt people. The Ravensbrück trials were held after the war as part of the Allies' plan to bring Nazi war criminals to justice. These trials didn't get as much attention as the Nuremberg trials, which focused on the top Nazi leaders. But they were still extremely important, especially for the women who had suffered at Ravensbrück. These trials gave the victims a voice and a chance to finally speak the truth in front of the world. The first Ravensbrück trial officially started on December 5, 1946 in Hamburg. It was led by a British military court. There were 29 people on trial, 16 women and 13 men, all of them accused of serious war crimes committed inside the camp. Many had been SS guards, camp doctors, or staff who had taken part in or allowed abuse, torture, and murder. As the trial went on, Dorothea sat there with a blank face. She didn't cry, she didn't show anger or fear, and she never once said she was sorry. She didn't even try to lie or pretend it didn't happen. But she didn't admit guilt either. Her behavior shocked the court. Many people watching expected her to break down or at least show some emotion, but she never did. One of the British officers later said that Dorothea acted like she didn't care about anything. The survivors who testified were often emotional. They cried, they shook, or paused to gather themselves. But Dorothea just stared straight ahead, as if she had nothing to do with any of it. The evidence against her was strong. More than a dozen women stood up and gave detailed, clear statements about what they had seen and experienced. The court also had written documents from the camp, rosters, reports, and paperwork that proved Dorothea's position and responsibilities. There was no way to argue against it. Every piece of evidence added to the picture of a woman who had fully embraced the Nazi system and used her power to hurt as many people as possible. The trial didn't drag on for months, like some of the bigger ones. The court reached a decision quickly. The judges had seen enough, and they knew what the punishment had to be. On February 3, 1947, Dorothea was officially sentenced to death. She was only 26 years old, but she had already caused so much pain. The sentence shocked no one. Even other Nazis who had been on trial alongside her seemed to understand that she wouldn't be spared. The British military court was in charge of her punishment. They chose hanging as the method of execution. That was the standard for Nazi war criminals at the time. The man chosen to do the job was Albert Pierrepoint, one of the most experienced executioners in British history. He had already hanged many high-ranking Nazis by then, including some of the worst criminals from other camps. For weeks after the trial, Dorothea was kept in prison as her execution date got closer. There were no delays, no last-minute changes, no appeals. The British didn't allow drawn-out legal games. Once the court gave the death sentence, the process moved quickly. On the morning of May 2, 1947, Dorothea was taken from Hamelin prison in northern Germany. This prison had become the main site for carrying out executions of Nazi war criminals. That morning, several other people from the Ravensbrück trial were also scheduled to die. One by one, they were led to the gallows. Dorothea didn't cry or beg for her life. Just like during the trial, she showed no emotion. When her turn came, she was led out of her cell, walked through the prison hallway, and taken straight to the execution room. Pierrepoint did his job quickly, and within seconds, it was over. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave, like the others. No ceremony, no memorial. The British didn't want these criminals to be remembered or honored in any way. After her execution, not many people talked about Dorothea. The world moved on. The focus was more on high-ranking Nazi leaders. But over time, as survivors wrote more books and gave interviews, her name started appearing again. Documentaries, court records, and camp reports started revealing just how brutal she had been. Historians studying Ravensbrück found that she wasn't just a minor player. She had played a central role in keeping the camp running. What makes Dorothea's story so disturbing is not just what she did, but how young she was when she did it. She was only in her early 20s when she started hurting people, and then executed at 26. That's a short life, but one filled with incredible cruelty.